Hello and welcome to Becoming Naturalized to Place, California's Feral Cabbages. I'm Janine Shepard and I will be your host for this session. Thank you to Terra Chips for sponsoring this session. The Terra Chips sponsorship made this beautiful platform possible and we're so grateful. Before I get started with this session, let's review our community agreements. We agree to be respectful, curious, and patient, to speak from our own experiences, avoiding jargon, be conscious of intent versus impact, take space, make space, and take care of yourself. I'm here with Alex Arzt. Alex is an artist, an educator, arts administrator, and gardener, calling in from Oakland, California. Alex facilitates connections between human and non-human spaces by creating publications, interactive objects, workshops, lectures, and experimental gardens. From 2018 to 2020, she was an affiliate artist at the Headlands Center for the Arts in Sausalito, California. She's a co-founder of the artist collective Whiz World and runs a small publishing press called A Magic Mountain. Today, Alex is here with us talking about feral cabbages and how they offer a model for survival through discovering their ecological niches, forming cooperative communities, and creating multi-species partnerships. Alex, I'm so excited to hear all about this. Welcome to the Seed Savers Exchange virtual conference.
Thank you so much, Janine. Let me go ahead and share my screen here and we can get started. Are you able to see that?
Yes, it looks great.
Great, thank you. So hello and welcome everyone. My name's Alex. Like Janine was saying, I'm an interdisciplinary artist and I'm based in Oakland, California. Thank you so much to the Seed Savers Exchange for all their work putting together this amazing conference. And thanks Janine for hosting the session today. And finally, thanks to all of you for attending. So since this is a virtual conference and we're joining from all over, I invite you to please write where you're coming from in the chat and what made you choose to attend this session. I'm joining from Oakland, like I said, and it's the territory Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. And in order to ground us into place a bit more, and since many of us are gardeners and plant lovers, I wanted to share an image of my garden a couple weeks ago when it was peak poppy time. And if you're not familiar with the Bay Area, the summers have been historically and notoriously chilly, but up in Oakland, where I am, they can get quite warm and sunny. And I'm telling you this because we have a Mediterranean climate and it will be important later in the presentation. So today I'll be talking about my research and engagement with the feral cabbages of California. That is, cabbages that have escaped gardens and naturalized themselves on the coast. My talk will include personal storytelling, an overview of my research, and instructions on cabbage breeding. I'll speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. So after 5 years of working with these plants, I propose that California's feral cabbages are a food crop resilient to extreme weather, toxic air, and contaminated soil. Their blanket taxonomic name is Brassica oleracea, variety oleracea, and they often grow around inactive lighthouses and military bases. Many of them escaped cultivation at the turn of the century, and after more than 100 years growing without intervention, have become naturalized on the coast here. And these are two examples of them growing at the Point Bonita and Pigeon Point lighthouses. So in 2018, I transplanted a few seedlings from Point Bonita to the yard in my former home in East Oakland, and they absolutely thrived in the soil there, to my surprise. And this is the same space again in 2023. I photographed it in this view for 5 years until I moved out in February of this year. And I continue to grow them in my new home garden from the first slide. And so the cabbages readily embrace the conditions of the garden as well as the rugged seaside cliffs. And by engaging with them both at their coastal homes and at my home, my work with these plants has opened up a deepened awareness of place and human-plant relationships. So here we'll start with a few helpful definitions to guide us. So a wild plant has not been artificially selected by humans, so its genes have not been intentionally manipulated. And on the left is an example of a wild cabbage that grows in the Greek islands. And then on the right, feral plants, they descend from artificially selected ancestors, but live outside of human cultivation. Kind of like how we commonly describe house cats that live on their own in the wild as feral cats. And then domesticated plants are human-propagated organisms that adapt to humans and the environments they provide. And then a cultivar is an organism, and especially one of an agricultural or horticultural variety or strain, originating and persistent under cultivation. So like in this old seed catalog, the domesticated plant is the cabbage and the cultivars are all the named varieties you see. So with Brassica oleracea, it can be difficult to parse out the wild from the feral or to even pin them down in a single category. There are at least 6 unique feral cabbage populations on the California coast that I'm aware of, and I'm currently cultivating 4 of them. And they include plants from the Half Moon Bay State Beach in Half Moon Bay, which is about an hour or so south of San Francisco. The Pigeon Point Lighthouse in Pescadero, which is about 2 hours south of San Francisco. Point Bonita Lighthouse in Sausalito, just across the Golden Gate Bridge. Point Montera Lighthouse, which is near Pescadero. And the Mendocino Headlands, which is about 3 hours north of San Francisco. And I'm realizing there's certainly more to be discovered out there. For example, a friend recently gave me seeds from a cabbage she found in Morro Bay on the Central Coast. So this whole project started with the Point Bonita cabbage. This is a map of the Marin Headlands when it was a US military reservation. And it's now part of the Golden Gate Recreation Area, which is, like I said, just north of San Francisco. And Point Bonita can be seen circled on the map here. And I was a resident artist at Headlands Center for the Arts for 4 years, and part of my time there involved long walks through the coastal chaparral landscape. And the lighthouse was just a short walk from my studio. So this interpretive panel was my first introduction to the Point Bonita cabbage. And it reads, "Cabbage plants you see along the Point Bonita Trail are descendants grown in early lighthouse keepers' gardens. This variation of cabbage, originally from Europe, thrives in the cool, wet climate found in the Marin Headlands." And so beyond this, I found out later that there was very little information about this cabbage available. Point Bonita itself is a narrow basalt headland that juts out into the Pacific. The lighthouse was built there in 1855 and decommissioned in 1980. And the cabbages only grow from about this point on that you can see in the photograph on. They don't grow in the rest of the park. And I learned later that this is part of the cabbage's nature to form these small, isolated communities. And the original inhabitants and caretakers of the Marin Headlands were the coast Miwok. Their forced removal from their land by the Spanish missionaries began in the 1780s. And today, the Coast Miwok are part of the Federated Indians of Grattan Rancheria. So after 1848, The gold rush brought an influx of new settlers to the Bay Area, and with it, ship traffic. So the lighthouse was built. And the point Bonita cabbages are the same species as the cultivated crops, but have reverted to their feral state. As a result, they appear very different than the garden varieties. They have thick woody stems and smaller leaves. And this is one of my favorite plants that is literally growing out of the lighthouse. Yeah, the interpretive sign brought up more questions. So I set out to try to find their origins and learn more about these intriguing plants. One of the few initial accessible records of the cabbage was an entry in Marin Flora by botanist John Howell from 1949. This is the earliest mention of the point bonita cabbage by name that I've found. And he writes in a sweet and flowery description about it, "The sea, it would seem, has been a cabbage's one true and constant love." And to find the origin of the point bonita cabbage, I looked for evidence of the lighthouse keeper's vegetable gardens by locating the original house sites. Many of the ornamentals that the keepers planted around their houses had naturalized as well, like these narcissus and calla lilies. By introducing plants, they have significantly transformed the landscape. And most of the structures on Point Bonita were torn down, so I searched archives to piece together photos and maps to find the garden sites. And one of the only structures left were the cisterns, so I used those as a guidepost. I searched through any historical photographs I could find for evidence of the cabbages growing, and alas, I found none. This was the original keeper's house, photographed by the famous Edward Muybridge. I read whatever lighthouse keeper logs and inspection reports I could find in local archives, but still found no specific mention of cabbage. And then later in 2021, as soon as the National Archives in DC reopened, I went there to view the original Point Bonita lighthouse logs, and was disappointed to find that they mostly consisted of weather reports and notes on supplies, with an occasional noting of a birth or rescue at sea. Cabbage was too everyday to be mentioned. Place I did finally find a description of the cabbage came from this book, written by Norma Ingalls, who was the daughter of the lighthouse keepers who lived there beginning in 1901. Norma wrote about her family's experiences based on her mother's memories. She recounted, "Mom longed for corned beef brisket and cabbage accompanied by a head of fresh green cabbage, not cabbage that had wintered in a musty cellar or warehouse somewhere. On one of her frequent trips to San Francisco to visit her mother, Mom returned laden not only with a huge bag full of fresh vegetables, but also packets of seeds." So they plant the seeds and things start to grow. And the early winds had shriveled most of the last planting, but the hardier ones, large leaf cabbages and cauliflower, thrived. So I had to find the women's stories, because it's not in the dominant historical narrative to note that the wives there missed cabbage. And then in early 2020, I went to the California Academy of Sciences to view their herbarium, which is a collection of preserved plant specimens. And these folders are where the Brassica specimens are kept. The CAS houses the largest herbarium in the Western US, and yet there were no feral cabbages in their Brassica collection. So with the botany department's support, I set out to add the point bonita cabbage. And because of the pandemic, my specimens sat in their freezer for a year before I could mount them to paper, which you can see on the desk here. And now they are accessible to other researchers in person or online through the CAS. And they are categorized as both wild and cultivated in the collection. The plant from Oakland is on the right. You can see the larger leaves, and the point bonita is on the left. And these are the labels for each plant, which were kind of a fun poetic exercise in sort of describing the places that they came from and their plant associates. And part of my goal with this project is to make more information about these plants available to the public, because I think their origin story teaches us a lot about our relationship to plants, the land, and each other. And part of that process was creating this project on iNaturalist, which I called the wild and feral cabbages of the world. So this project aims to catalog the diversity of often isolated cabbage populations through this crowdsourced database. And the way iNaturalist projects work is by aggregating the 12 wild species in the Brassica oleracea group, in addition to the feral populations identified on iNaturalist, all into one place. So this mapping feature is how I found some of the feral populations here in California, which you can see clicking through here. And it really is amazing, an amazing tool for any plant or animal or insect or anything that you're interested in. And you can really get a sense of the scale of these plants and where they're located. You can see they're mostly located in coastal areas all over the world. And you can see there are a lot in coastal Europe and the Mediterranean, because this is in fact where Brassica oleracea was first domesticated. And then if you see, when you click the links, you'll see images and info and whether or not it's deemed research grade, which means more than one user has confirmed the ID. So I'll share a link to this. So please follow and add to the project if you use iNaturalist. And if you don't use iNaturalist, check it out. It's a great tool. So the cabbage's temporal and genetic history is inextricably linked to humans in this coevolutionary relationship. A 2021 genetic study of wild and feral brassica populations suggests that the cultivation of wild cabbages most likely began in Western Syria around 3,000 years before present. This is the archaeological site in Syria where they discovered brassica seeds in an ancient oven. And you can see on the map that it's on the Mediterranean coast. The 2021 study names Brassica cretica as the most likely original wild relative of the domesticated Brassica oleracea plants we know and love today. This is a plant growing on the Mediterranean coast of Israel, from iNaturalist. So cabbages escape cultivation and naturalize themselves in coastal environments similar to their origins, and can just as easily revert back to their secondary habitats of cultivated gardens. Brassica cretica is thought to have made this jump a few times in several thousands of years of its coevolution with humans. They have since been selectively bred into broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, kohlrabi, and Brussels sprouts, just to name a few. They're called the dog of the vegetable world because they have been artificially selected under many forms, all under the same genus and species. Similarly, and as is more commonly known, dogs have been artificially selected from gray wolves to form new breeds of the same species, Canis familiaris, but in wildly diverse morphologies. And all this leads me to think that maybe the plants possess a kind of genetic memory of 3,000 years of human hands harvesting their leaves, watering them, protecting them from harm, feeding their soil, spreading their seeds, and ensuring their survival. This long-term engagement with the feral cabbages offers a knowledge of the land, where they grow, and where I live through a process of making what writer William Least Heatmoon termed a deep map in his book Prairie Earth. A deep map is, quote, a way to be conscious of a place in such a manner as to hold multiple layers of understanding. For me, growing the feral cabbages in my garden in Oakland was an avenue towards building a deep map and forming a personal place-based ethic. That giving sustained attention to and caring for plants can reveal unknown histories and relationships, novel ways of being, and new avenues of survival. In 2017, I moved into this house in Oakland. I cleaned up the yard and put in plants from friends, gardening jobs, and seed packets. It became a semi-wild garden with cacti, ornamental flowers, and native plants. I let them manage the space themselves with minimal intervention, all with a preference for the cabbages, of course. And my early gardening philosophy, which was just to stick it in the ground and see what happens, was aided by the moderate climate of the Bay Area and the inherent fertility of the yard soil. I delighted in watching the cabbages grow huge and take over the yard. They flowered in February, seeded in the summer, and then sprouted all over after the winter rains. Previous tenants had largely neglected the outdoor space, and so the fruit trees and so-called weeds there largely maintained themselves. I became more curious about the soil and its fertility, which felt like an incredible gift in a mostly paved-over neighborhood. So I started searching in archives to learn more about the history of the soil. According to this 1852 map, the lot once existed between a salt marsh on the tidal banks of San Antonio Creek, just this body of water, and Encinal, which is evergreen oak woodlands. And so the house would have been somewhere in here. And through this process, it became apparent how difficult it is to read a landscape where there's little obvious trace of what came before, a phenomena which ecologists call shifting baseline syndrome. Some plants persist when the people who steward them leave and are forgotten. The same phenomena applies to this lot in Oakland and to all land with a known or unknown history of human cultivation. This is the Sassoon Marsh, which is 40 miles northeast of Oakland, and it's the largest contiguous brackish water marsh remaining on the West Coast. When I visited, it didn't seem very large at all. And I imagine this is what Oakland's marshes looked like before colonization. This map from 1857 shows more detail of the landscape. Around the time wild cabbages were first domesticated in Syria, the Ohlone were stewarding the fertile and abundant land of the East Bay by harvesting acorns, practicing controlled burns, hunting, foraging, and fishing. Spanish colonists stole their land and displaced them to the Catholic missions beginning in the 1770s. In the 1820s, the land was granted to the Peralta family by the Spanish king and became part of a 45,000-acre cattle ranch. It changed hands throughout the 1800s, towns were established, and finally it became part of Oakland in 1872. The original bay waterfronts with their ecologically rich tidal marshes were filled in to make way for train tracks and then the freeway, where gasoline-powered cars spewed lead into the air until 1996. And the house is just around this football field on the corner, just for context. So I didn't think to have the soil tested until 2021. And the levels of minerals, elements, and metals listed in parts per million were clues to the soil's history and memory. This was another layer towards forming a deep map. And it proved highly fertile, but also off the charts for lead, around 800 parts per million. Therefore, quote, not suitable for gardening. Until that point, I was largely ignorant of this ubiquitous urban problem and the resulting health implications, which include brain damage, digestive problems, and infertility. And these effects are most severe and lasting in children whose bodies retain more lead than adults. Learning of the contamination created a shift in my relationship to the land here, which was both poisonous and life-giving. I became afraid of it, and I also wanted to immerse myself in it to continue our ongoing collaboration. And in this dichotomy lied a confusing kind of grief. The soil itself, it's a bit sandy, easy to crumble in your hands, and medium dark brown like a light roast coffee. And I was discovering that the neglect of the property contributed to both the soil's toxicity and fertility. This is Mark Stumpf, who owned the house between 1989 and 2011. The photo on the left was taken in 2022, and the one on the right sometime in the 90s on the same spot, on the same steps. Mark told me how he removed layers of garbage from the yard and under the house after he bought it. Former tenants told me they had done the same at different periods of time. It was originally built around 1878 and, according to Mark, was painted with white lead paint. The house was foreclosed on in 2011 and purchased at a bank auction by my former landlord. Mark planted the fig, pear, and orange tree there in the 90s. He had a small vegetable garden, pictured here, and he remains an enthusiastic gardener. He buried 3 of his Irish wolfhounds in the front yard, beneath where the cabbages grew, and this surely added to the soil's fertility. The lead is in my blood and in the cabbage's tissues too. My blood lead level is 2 micrograms per deciliter, which is slightly higher than the average adult level in 2016 of 0.92. The sampled cabbage leaves were in the range of 3 parts per million. They were uptaking the heavy metal, and there is no standard safe lead level in food. Despite the temporary nature of my stewardship and the fact that the soil will all likely be covered over eventually, the garden was healing the soil. The plants uptake lead, add organic matter, and create biological diversity. Organic matter reduces the amount of lead available to the plants because of the way it chemically binds to the metal. Plant scientist and member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, Robin Wall Kimmerer, recounts in her book Braiding Sweetgrass an epiphany she had sitting in her garden one day. She realized that the land loved her back through, quote, material and spiritual relationships of reciprocity. She writes, quote, food plants and people act as selective forces on each other's evolution. The thriving of one in the best interest of the other. This to me sounds a bit like love. After reading that, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude at the thought of the cabbage garden in Oakland loving me back. But with love, of course, comes inevitable loss and grief. And for gardeners like me who rent, this creates a conundrum. In a region with some of the most expensive housing in the country, the value of this lot, which has risen 30% over the last decade, has nothing to do with its fertility. But value is subjective and relational. I eventually did move away and said goodbye to that garden. I diligently saved the cabbage and flower seeds each fall and kept a mental map of where the bulbs were planted to dig them up when I left. According to Lise Heatmoon, quote, to know a place in any real and lasting way is sooner or later to dream it. That's how we come to belong to it in the deepest sense. When I lived there, I had recurring dreams of the landlord mowing down the garden and destroying the cabbages. In the last one I remember, he replaced them with a new condo-style landscape design and in the dream, I cried on my knees like a grieving mother. The plants and I belong to this place. And my dreams about the garden being destroyed eventually became reality in a way a few months after I moved out. Maybe some of you in the audience have had to move away from a garden and experience this kind of letting go. Because I brought so many seeds, bulbs, and cuttings to my new home, I had taken the gifts of this place with me. And I still hope the cabbage seeds continue to germinate here after the winter rains. So another part of this project involves breeding the feral populations, breeding them together with the goal of arriving at a genetic mishmash of adaptations to California's environment in order to create more resilient cabbages to share with other gardeners and farmers. The Oakland cabbages flourished in a chaotic neighborhood with prolonged drought followed by multiple atmospheric rivers, heat waves, and wildfire smoke capable of blocking out the sun. Like in this image from September 2020, when the leaves were covered in ash. It is urgent to develop food crops that can withstand such extremes. I'm approaching this process very much with an amateur spirit with the help of Carol Depp's clear instructional book on plant breeding. I highly recommend it. And thinking about it, I think about how most of the vegetables we eat today came from the sustained attention of early agricultural peoples who selected seed from one plant over another for thousands of years, looking for sweeter fruit, bigger leaves, or higher yields. And in spring 2021, I created a cross between the Point Bonita and Mendocino cabbages. And this is the process of seeds developing over time after being pollinated. And then last summer, I germinated the resulting seeds and grew those plants in pots, and then transplanted them to my new home. And after they flowered, I crossed them again with pollen from Point Montera, Pigeon Point, and Half Moon Bay cabbages. And next year, I'll take those hybrids and mix them up again, until I arrive at a cabbage with relatives from each feral population. So just briefly, I'll tell a bit about the process of breeding Brassica oleracea to the best of my knowledge. So these are the cabbage flowers. And to review some basic botany, the stigma in the center receives the pollen and carries it down to fertilize the seeds. And then the anthers release pollen. The flowers are self-incompatible, which means they do not self-pollinate. And Brassica oleracea are also biennial, which means they flower in the second year and then die the next. And usually the first thing I'll do is go out to visit the feral cabbages and collect flowers in envelopes, which then release pollen I'll use to fertilize the plants. And this video kind of just shows the process. So in late winter, the cabbages start to flower, and I'll put paper bags over the stems with flowers that haven't opened yet to make sure no other pollinators visit them before me. And I label each stem with which feral population I'm fertilizing it with, which is that red tag you see there. And then I'll collect the pollen on a clean brush and gently tap the stigma on any newly opened flowers. And then I rebag them and repeat this process again in a day or two when more flowers open back up. And then once all the flowers are pollinated, I leave a mesh bag over the seed pods to keep the birds from eating them because the finches love them. And then August, September, they start drying out and are ready to be harvested. And I collect all the pods in these bins and leave them for a while to completely dry out. Once they're dry, to thresh the seeds, I first stomp on them in the bins to break the pods. And I used a homemade threshing screen to separate the seeds further. And then the next step is winnowing the seeds. And this was my setup this year. It's nothing fancy. So winnowing removes even more of the plant material by blowing it away and letting the heavier seeds fall onto the screen. And then you end up with something like this. So I think of these new cabbage seeds with relatives from all the feral populations as another form of a deep map. The genes in one of these seeds reach backwards and forwards in time, including traces of the first domestication of the plants in Syria to the present rapid acceleration of climate change we're experiencing in California and globally. The seeds include traces of my small gestures, along with the many thousands of hands throughout time that have made this plant what it is today. And the map will continue to be created in its many layers across time because, as we've seen, these plants aren't easily contained and very much possess their own agency. And I want to return for a moment to the Oakland garden. So in an attempt to reduce the inevitable aphid infestations that come with repeated brassica plantings, I set out to create a symbiotic garden by planting phacelia, buckwheat, and alyssum, which I found out are all plants that attract predatory and parasitoid wasps. So the wasps came and I noticed an increase of aphid mummies under the cabbage leaves. And then later on a walk to Point Bonita, I noticed that wild buckwheat, phacelia, and alyssum were already growing around the feral cabbages, creating cooperative ecological relationships among other native and non-native species. They were naturalizing to place in the way that Kimmerer proposes to, quote, throw off the mindset of the immigrants. The feral cabbages offer a kind of land ethic as immigrants themselves by establishing communities with the common goals of mutuality, reciprocity, and cooperation, as opposed to competing, poisoning, and smothering a place's native flora. And these are characteristics of what we would often call invasive or noxious plants. Like the common plantain that Kimmerer describes in braiding sweetgrass, the cabbages have become naturalized to California. They reveal a path toward survival through discovering their ecological niches, forming cooperative communities, and creating multi-species partnerships, including with me and other humans as dispersal agents and caretakers. They are worthy of our attention and study as a means to connect us further to the places where we live, and to elucidate an ancient and ongoing human-plant relationship. As a potential source of resilient, nutritious food, and as connectors to our plant communities, the feral cabbages can both feed us and teach us. My research and process towards building this deep map continues at my new garden, where a soil test revealed less fertility and also less lead contamination. Looking ahead, I hope to gain access to more space to grow the plants and expand the breeding project. And I also hope to one day travel overseas to visit the wild and feral cabbages there and to collect pollen and seeds to incorporate in the project. And I'll end here with an image of a Mendocino headlands cabbage growing in my new garden with other native and non-native plants. And if you'd like to stay connected, there are a few ways to engage with me in the project that I want you to be aware of. So you can follow my iNaturalist project. The project is also on Instagram at cabbage_freak. You can request Point Bonita cabbage seeds through the exchange. Visit my website. The link is in my conference profile. And you can also read the essay this talk was based on in the New Farmer's Almanac by the Greenhorns. So I hope we have the opportunity to connect, and thank you so much for your attention today.
Thank you, Alex. What a beautiful presentation, and what beautiful plants. For all of you watching, please go ahead and add any questions you have to the chat, and I will read them off to Alex. Alex, I love thinking about this idea of multi-species partnerships. I love how that reframes the relationships that we often hear between plants and peoples. And thank you for sharing this deep relationship that you've developed with them. What do you think people have to learn from these wild cabbages?
Yeah, I think many things. I think one is that idea I was touching on at the end of the presentation of sort of finding like a cooperative, collective spirit when you interact with land, when you interact with a space, which I feel like they kind of quietly embody in their own way. So that's one thing. And also hopefully just like to generate a sense of curiosity about the plants we interact with every day. Like nothing's more common these days than like broccoli and cabbage and kale, right? But the stories of where they came from are actually pretty amazing and engaging.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a question here from Susanna from New Mexico. And this person is asking, what's the difference between a feral plant and a naturalized plant?
Yeah, so feral terminology when talking about plants can get really, really slippery really quickly, which makes it kind of an interesting discussion topic. So thank you for that question. So if a feral plant is something that was domesticated at one point, but then escaped cultivation and could be living anywhere on its own, sort of like feral cats. They're just like out there hunting mice and birds, doing their thing. They don't really need us to take care of them. And then thinking about a naturalized plant, if we're thinking about the cabbages, or anything, even plants that are termed like invasive, they are sort of like in a place where they didn't originate and have sort of naturalized themselves. So they're participating in the ecologies, whether it's like a positive, negative, or neutral relationship with the native flora and fauna. So it's something that is like taking up a space where it hadn't originally.
This is more of a comment than a question, but I love this idea. So Stuart has been letting cabbages go to seed in his garden here and is finding all sorts of fun things happening.
Thank you, Stuart.
Mary Alice Reed is asking, so you found these cabbages near lighthouses. Did you also find them near missions?
I have not found them near missions, but I also have not explored there. I think the interesting thing about lighthouses is that they are visited, but they are in a way kind of like abandoned as well. And they're usually in like pretty rugged, inaccessible places like the coast. So that's sort of the places that facilitated the cabbages, but I haven't explored what plants grow around the missions.
This is a question from Sean. So Sean is referring to the seed trade census, which is something that Seed Savers Exchange puts out. We do research on what kind of seeds are commercially available. And so part of that research is comparing what used to be available in the commercial seed trade to what is available now. Sean is noticing that there's been over 50% drop in open pollinated cabbage varieties from 1981 to 2020. And is also noting that there's a big isolation distance involved in cabbages, and wondering if feral cabbages are playing a part in this at all, which I don't know if you have any insight to that. I can give my 2 cents too, but I'll give you a moment to
Yeah, I would
respond if you'd like to.
love to hear your thoughts on this, Janine. And thanks, Sean, for this question.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I couldn't tell you, why exactly that's happening, but I do think that most of the time, when we're seeing changes in what's available commercially, it has more to do with what is commercially successful, and I'm guessing that it doesn't have that much to do with the isolation, distance, and feral cabbages. But I like the question, and I like thinking about what variables are at play for something like that.
Yeah, and thanks so much for looking that stat up. That was actually
Yeah.
something researching. I was trying to find some data on that and wasn't able to. So now I know where to look, and I appreciate
Yes,
that a lot.
the Feed Trade Census. It's a great resource.
Yeah, because
Um,
potentially, just real quick, those early 1900s varieties could be potentially lost varieties in 2023. So this could be a way
right,
to
that
bring them back
definitely
in a way.
happens too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sean has another thought here, or another question here. Um, he's noticed what look like giant thistles and maybe wondering if they are feral artichokes escaped from cultivated areas. Do you have any idea about that, or how a person would go about figuring that out?
That's very possible. I guess you'd have to like pull over on the 80 and get a closer look. You could also check iNaturalist around those areas and see if anything comes up, or you can search by species on iNaturalist and then check the maps. So that's one resource, but it's definitely possible because I'm not 100% certain, but I believe artichokes also come from the Mediterranean region. Someone might need to fact check me on that, but
And I'm thinking about just times that I've seen plants that, maybe I've grown in my garden, but I've never seen in their original habitat, or in a place that resembles their original habitat. I'm curious, when you first saw these wild cabbages, did you recognize them right away? Did you know what they were? Or maybe you were already looking for them at that point. But can you tell us about that, when you first saw wild cabbages and what that was like?
yeah, well, it started, yeah, with that interpretive panel. You kind of get the intro before you walk on the trail down to the
Yeah.
lighthouse. And I was with my friend Annie, and we were just like, we should eat these. So we started like trying them, and they have a really salty taste actually, because they're getting all this like ocean
Mm-hmm.
air.
Sure.
And they have that, they're very bitter, the wild ones. But yeah, something about them, something about that just like launched this whole curiosity for
Yeah.
me. So
Interesting. Laura is asking, are you harvesting and consuming these plants that you're breeding?
yeah, that's a good question too. Thanks, Laura. I When I first planted them, I didn't really eat them because I wanted to see what they looked like in their fullest form. And I treated them kind of like you might like a rose bush or something. I kind of like babied them, which isn't
Yeah.
usually how we interact with cabbages, right? They're there to be eaten. Um, and I know it's like pretty a precious way to approach growing a crop. But so I did eat them a few times before I had the soil test, and they do taste, the garden ones at least taste similar to collard greens, and I prepared them that way. Just like olive oil and salt, and they're pretty good. They were pretty delicious. So that is something I would like to pursue more. Hopefully in like soil without lead contamination. So.
Yeah. Okay, there's a question here. I'm just going to read this off. So Sean, again, Sean, thank you for the questions. Let's see. Sean's girlfriend is from Romania and has been looking for a thin-leafed, typically flat-topped cabbage variety that is traditionally used to make cabbage rolls. Um, Sean's found a lot of such varieties, but they're all hybrids and or patented. Any idea for such an open pollinated variety, or do you know anyone I might ask?
I am not sure. Yeah. I think you'd have to go to Romania and knock on doors. It sounds like.
Yeah.
Um,
And Sean, I don't know that specifically either, but it sounds like you're probably familiar with the exchange, but I think that's another great community of people who would be more likely than me to know the answer or to know where to look for that too, just because it's so many people with so many different connections to things. Let's see. I had another question here. What was it? Maybe not. Well, thank you so much. I have one more question that I was thinking about, just in terms of, again, thinking of this kind of comparison and relationship between cabbages and humans, and so many of us are looking to make homes in new places, and um, it seems like the cabbages are doing a good job of that. And I'm wondering if this is part of what you reflect on when you're doing this project and getting to know these cabbages, and what kind of what kind of home ideas you're sharing with these cabbages, so when you're creating that relationship with them.
like, how does it make me think about home differently, or how I make
Sure,
home?
yeah, and I guess the thing that I was noticing is just that they're able to create a home in new spaces, and it seems like they're coming up in these cracks, and they're making this place a home that wasn't originally their home, and I'm wondering if that's um, part of the magic of their calling to you, and maybe it's not, but it's part of the magic of what I was noticing in your presentation.
Yeah, I think there's definitely like creating, they've created like a sense of place where I live now. And yeah, like you were saying, part of the thing that really sparked my interest in them is their just resilience that they can like.
Yeah.
I had a slide in here earlier of a kale plant I found growing around the corner from my house in concrete. And just little things like that. It's just like, wow, these plants can really just grow anywhere. And um, yeah, and they're also very generous, right? They're nutritious. They could be food. I would sit on my steps and watch like the hummingbirds visit all the flowers, and
Yeah.
they form those like ecological partnerships. And yeah, there's something really beautiful about that. And I'm sure a lot of gardeners have that impulse to sort of like share their space with other animals and plants and birds and insects. So there is something homey about that, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This is such an interesting project. I feel like I definitely want to keep following it and seeing where you go with it. Again, for those of you watching, there are links in the chat here so you can follow Alex as she continues with this project. Thanks so much for being here. And Alex, thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you so much. And thanks for all the wonderful questions and for your attention.